Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar discussion video. This one is going to be about the comics, I suppose, just a more general discussion on, where they need to go in the future, the mistakes that have kind of been made along the way, what needs to be improved, that sort of thing. And so I'm going to start off by basically just talking about, I suppose, 3 moments from the comic, when they happened, I suppose, when these books were released, and what that kind of in a way says about the comics. So we'll start off with The Promise Part 2. So the second of these kind of mainline Avatar comics came out May 30th, 2012. So basically 7 years ago is when this book came out. Now, you may be asking, why The Promise Part 2? And the reason I say that is because this is the comic where we get the breakup of Mai and Zuko. So it happens right here, as you can see, and it sticks to this day. Right now, where we are currently in the comics, they are still not back together. Smoke and Shadow, of course, tackled them, I suppose, being in the same scenes together, but it didn't end with them back together, and right now, nothing seems to be suggesting that, we're getting that story with Mai and Zuko happening again. So, how much longer are we going to have to wait? The second thing I'll bring up is The Search Part 3. So, obviously, the final part of the second Avatar comic series, this book was released October 30th, 2013. So, getting close to 6 years ago at this point. And the scene I'm talking about from this one is that it's the last time Azula and Ursa saw each other. And it was obviously with Ursa still as Noriko, basically, so it was, before she, it was back to, I suppose, properly being Ursa again. So it's still this case of we haven't got them interacting since. And it's obviously a big dynamic that I think a lot of people are waiting to see. But it's been that long, it's been teased for that long that this is the core relationship for Azula. This is the thing that will be, I suppose, very make or break about whether or not things are going to change for Azula or not. The final thing I'll bring up is Smoke and Shadow Part 3. So the third part of the 4th Avatar comic series. This one came out April 12th, 2016. Now, that means that this book was released, coming up on 3 years. In just a week or two, this book will be out for 3 years. And the scene I'm talking about here isn't really anything specific. It's just, this was the last time Azula made an appearance in the comics. This was the last content that featured Azula. And Azula is one of the more important characters in the comic because she has such an open story. The Search, a little bit of The Promise, The Search, Smoke and Shadow have all tackled her story to a degree, suggesting that it is this ongoing story across the comics. But then you look at how much content we've got with regards to that versus how much time has actually passed. And you can sort of see where the problem is. This is kind of long-form storytelling that isn't working so well because of the format of the comics. Like a large part of why, like I say, Mai and Zuko haven't got back together is that where Smoke and Shadow leaves off, it seems like they're very likely to get back together. But because it's been 3 years since we've returned to that story, and it's been 3 years since Mai and Zuko have been in the same scene together, it's just, we haven't had even the potential, the idea for the next section of their journey to happen. And I think very likely it probably won't take too much more scenes of Zuko and Mai together to have them put back together. But it's that combined with the fact that I have noticed as more and more time has gone on, especially on my channel, the 2 most popular videos on my channel are the 2 videos I did covering Avatar and Korra family trees. And they have had the most views, likes, and especially comments. And it gives me the sense that this is something that Avatar fans, both hardcore and casual, care about, is seeing where these characters go in the future. And so it feels crazy to say it, that these relationships that were set up and kind of left sort of in place back in 2008 with the end of Avatar: The Last Airbender, some of them still aren't fully confirmed yet. So Katara and Aang are obviously confirmed because of, their family, and we see it in Korra. But the fact that Izumi's mother, Zuko's daughter's mother, is just this question that we don't have a full answer to. It more than likely is May, but we can't say 100% for sure that it is really, really crazy to think about. Similarly, Sokka and Suki, the fact that they haven't really been in a scene together, and that's why I suppose Imbalance Part 2 is going to be such an exciting book, because it's like the return of Suki for the first time. I think also since Smoke and Shadow, I think was more or less the last time we saw Suki, if I remember correctly. So there's a lot of things like that where it's just what should be relatively minor things, like, oh, Suki's appearing again, and it's only a case where it's only like 2 comics on from this book, but it's been 3 years. That it's stuff like that, and that's where I think the comics really need to work on. In that, like in this case, I understand part of that is because there was a pretty big break between the end of North and South going into Imbalance with the change of creative team and also Turf Wars coming out. But it seems crazy that like just one extra comic book being released suddenly changes the schedule so much that like it's 3 years between character appearances, that important things that people really care about, like this relationship, is just left on the sideline for years and years basically. And it comes down to, I suppose, the case of like, are the comics really covering the story that the fans want to be told? And I think you'd ultimately have to say with North and South, and probably Imbalance where it will maybe get to, not especially. Like, I think a lot of people like the comics, and I like the comics too. And I really appreciate that the characters are written in character, I think, all the way from The Promise, all the way up to Imbalance. I think the writers get the characters right. I think the problem, though, if you look at the entire run of the comics, is definitely the how important each of the stories is, and how that's definitely had a bit of variety in like quality. I think the first 4, like The Promise, The Search, The Rift, and Smoke and Shadow, are all very notable comics because of what they do. I think North and South was definitely the start of, I suppose, this what basically has become a 2-3 year period of just comics that haven't felt as good as the earlier comics, simply because of what's being presented. Like, I'm not saying there's nothing in North and South. I like Katara's arc in North and South. I like Melina. I like the dynamic with Hakoda and some of the interactions that are going on there. But the plot, where it went, what the big takeaways were, I feel like they didn't really do all that much to, I suppose, make that comic as notable or interesting as it could have been. Similarly, Turf Wars as the first Korra comic, I felt, the more and more I look back on that, especially with the recent release of the hardcover, which I reviewed just last week, looking at that story again, it's baffling in a way that they decided that, oh, everyone's super excited to see the return of Korra, what's happening next, we'll lead with this story. And it just, to me, plot-wise, doesn't work in terms of this is where the starting point for the comics is. Now, it feels like they're immediately going to correct that in Ruins of the Empire, because they're giving us Kuvira, and that feels like the Search kind of level type story, where it seems like they're going to let Kuvira have more or less the Ursa style of storytelling that the Search had, where a good a third to half of the book is actually just full on about her. So that should be an immediate improvement for the Korra comics, and then we'll see where they go from there. Will they tackle the stories that I think people want to be told, tell more important things, use the characters a bit better? Whereas I think the Avatar comics started very well, and they've just faded a little bit recently. Imbalance is in a weird spot, I think, because I think even just before it was released, I got to a position where I'm kind of like, look, it's not really the story I necessarily am really wanting at this point in time, but I'll give it a chance. Imbalance Part 1 was good, But I do question what the takeaways will be by the end of the book. And I think this is where they're perhaps struggling a little bit with the time period that they're dealing with. And that being that what they're trying to do with the Avatar comics is connect the dots. Connect the end of Avatar The Last Airbender to the start of Korra, primarily through the slow and gradual progress towards Republic City. The problem, though, is that it is very slow. It's just the start of this. And it feels like unless we do a really big time skip, we are not going to reach the point where we actually see the formation of Republic City until the characters are much older. And at that point, it's kind of like, can we're sort of stuck to the characters being this age until we resolve a couple of things. But we also need to move on for the overall plot to progress. But the fans kind of want more of, I suppose, an anthology type storytelling thing where we want to see the big events. We want to see like May and Zuko get engaged and kind of those type of things. Katara and Aang get engaged. We want to see, who, Su Yin's father is. Get those questions answered. See, does Sokka ever have kids? Does he stay with Suki? The big things that are presented that we don't know about are the things that we want to get to eventually. And it's pretty telling, like especially those family trees that Nickelodeon officially put out, that there are so many like random blank points on it that there's just no one on the who Azumi's mother section is. There's no one next to Sokka, and so on. Those type of questions, and then just like with Azula, like I was kind of leading with, there's nothing. Like she's not mentioned in Korra. We don't know what happens to her. But she has this very interesting story that's happening right now, but we haven't come back to it in a while. And I'm fine with that. I'm not saying every comic in a row has to be the Azula story, but it is the thing that I think has consistently kept people's attention on the comics in terms of always coming back to it. Anytime Azula gets brought up, it always creates a discussion, and I think a good discussion, because you have a variety of different views on Azula. You have the people who are very, very sympathetic towards the character, and almost to the point where like they're absolving her of any wrongdoing. Then you have the people who are very strict on Azula and are very much like she's done so much wrong that she doesn't deserve the resolution. And you have, I suppose, more of my perspective where I can see both sides. I think she, like Zuko, is deserving of a resolution, an ability to redeem herself, just like Zuko was. Because Zuko made mistakes as well, as did Azula. So if we give Zuko that chance, we should give Azula the same chance to redeem herself. But at the same time, not lose sight of the fact that she has done all of this bad stuff. Now, obviously, there's a bit of a difference in, I suppose, just how bad the things that Azula and Zuko actually did, and that's where the line kind of has to be drawn here. But still, she's deserving of a chance, and I think the comics up to now have presented that view that Aang, Katara, and Zuko, both over the course of the search, showed a tendency to want to help Azula in some way and get her to a better point. And where they leave her off, there still has to be some development towards that point. And what's so great about it is that the comics have been subtly setting up the idea that she is changing. She's moved away from wanting to be the Fire Lord herself, but she still has that base core view of she still feels that people need to be controlled through fear. And how will that change? And that's why characters like Ki, Ursa, Zuko, even like Ikem to a degree, could be very important coming up. Even Iroh, like it'd be interesting if he plays a role in her story. But it's the example of like, when are we going to get back to that story? And this is the ultimate problem I've always had with the comics, in that it doesn't necessarily feel like there's too much of a plan about where the comics are going. And this is, I think, the thing that I think a lot of people have struggled with these comics. Dark Horse never really make it clear if they're building towards something, or is there an end goal in sight. It just feels like they'll get a new creative team on board, they'll announce the next comic, and it's just kind of like flip a coin as to whether it's going to continue the story or kind of be more of its own thing. I assume we will eventually get back to Azula, but we're waiting, and the time just goes on. It's been 3 years now. Certain topics it's been longer, and so on. Like I said, the main Zuko thing, they've been broken up since 2012. Can we make some progress here? And this is where they need to, I think, be a little bit clearer with us as the fan base and be like, okay, we are now announcing this creative team is going to be staying on for 3 comic series, not just 3 books, but 3 full comic series. And over the course of this, we hope to tell this story. And maybe they won't be as blunt as that, but there needs to be more of a sense of planning ahead to avoid stuff like, oh, Jean Yang and Team Guru are going away. Let's basically spend a year bringing the next creative team together, and during that year there's no Avatar comics. And the wait just kind of continues on and on and on. In that, is Peter Wortman and Faith Erin Hicks staying on board for the next Avatar comic? Because come like a month or 2 from now, we have Imbalance Part 2 and we're leading into Part 3, we'll be looking for what the next announcement is. Because say what you will about Imbalance, it's not going to bring the series to some incredible end unless it does something absolutely incredible. It's not going to be the last Avatar comic. So do you have another creative team on board ready to kind of slot straight in to tell the rest of the story, or what? Those are the big questions. What are you trying to get towards? Like, very clearly, if you track across the 5 full comic series that we have right now, they are telling the story of the slow and steady progress towards Republic City. But if we continue at this rate, we're going to be in comic series number 25 by the time we're actually ready to call it Republic City, have it officially be what it is, more or less, in or around the time of Korra, unless they start to do kind of time skips and jump around a little bit. And in a way, that's what we need to sort of add the variety, to just change things up a bit, because the characters still are fairly young. The timeline in these books is a little vague in that, okay, Aang is 12 at the start of the series, so he's 13 by the end. There's 1 year time skip at the start of the comic, so Aang is 14, and then roughly a year and a bit happens over the course of the comic. So I place Aang as being around 15 and a half, going on 16, give or take. And it's difficult. It's difficult to exactly place it. But yeah, Aang is probably just about 16. Still very, very young. And I get it, Toph and Aang are both the 2 youngest members of the team. But still, are we really going to be getting towards those big things that we want with the character still that young? By all accounts, it doesn't seem like it is the case where they found Republic City when they're this young. And then I think we roughly know from just the ages of the characters' children that they don't have children that early on. So they have them a little bit later on in their lives. Not super late, but not as early as you'd maybe think. So before we're getting to the point where Aang and Katara have children, there's a long period before we go to get there. And that's why, in a way, I'm putting a lot of pressure in a way on something like Imbalance to have by the end of it, you've set up the fact that here is Air Temple Island before it is Air Temple Island. Is this the book that you're actually connecting Aang to this place? And by the end of this book, he is going to say, I have to be close to this city, Cranefish Town, which is going to become Republic City, as it's developing. I have to be close, so I'm going to choose to live here. I'll train the Air Acolytes here, and this will be my home. Because what haven't they addressed over the course of this comic, even though a year or 2 has passed, where Aang actually lives. I get he's a nomad, but they haven't really addressed any sense of okay, Katara and Sokka have been traveling with him and so on, because they have traveled all this time. Those 2 have been back home to the south. What is the house situation for them? Aang is going to have to be involved a bit more heavily in what's going on in Cranefish Town. Is this where that decision is made? And similarly, when does he discover the sky bison, the other lemurs and stuff like that, to give him sort of hope for the future. It's those sort of questions where, like, you've set up a very minor thing of just, here is Air Temple Island. Now commit to it and actually do something with it. Because otherwise all you're doing with Imbalance is basically being like, okay, here is the plot that is later covered in depth in Korra. Let's just set it up here and do something that's kind of impactful, but we can't really do anything all that serious with. And I think that's the overall fear for something like an Imbalance. Something where all it is doing is telling, in a way, a less important version of a plot that's going to happen later. Whereas you could be telling important stories about the things that we sort of know happen, but we want to see the details of, like Aang finding the bison, like, you know, certain characters getting engaged or what. Like, does Sokka ever find the space sword? Questions like that are what fans obviously would look for, and it's a way to, like, fill in a story without just needing to, you know, do the long form storytelling of, here in this comic we'll do this minor step towards Republic City. Because, like, take North and South for example. What did that really do in terms of the plot towards Republic City? It began to include the Water Tribe a little bit more in a place that has primarily been more Earth Kingdom and Fire Nation focused. Now here's a way where, with the port and the South kind of expanding into the rest of the world, this is a way to bring the South further in, especially with, like, what they did in the Rift with Katara's friends who were working in the factory and so on. That was having the Water Tribe aspect come into things. And that's a nice little detail, but you need time before you get to the point where it actually is Republic City as we know it. In that, like, I think it's fun to get those little moments. Like, if we, over the course of these comics, get the first time that they start to bring up the idea of what, like, pro-bending is, I got the impression it's maybe a little bit more of a newer thing. It's not something that happens, like, all that soon from the Avatar comic perspective, but it's stuff like that that's kind of more of an interesting perspective to have on things. Then, like, more personally, like, you know, when does Katara, like, maybe announce to people that, hey, bloodbending is a thing, but we need to ban it because of the nature of the technique and so on. Those are the questions that, like, I definitely have about these sort of things. So it's all of that stuff that I think is it's frustrating with the comics because while they're very good, they could be so much better if there were more of them, if they were more regular. And a large part of why I'm doing this video now is because, you know, we're in the 4th month of 2019 and we still haven't had a single piece of new Avatar content. Yes, Turf Wars hardcover was just released, but it's a comic that we already have. It wasn't really anything new. And we're still waiting. And it's going to be closer towards the very middle of this year before we finally get that new content. And then when it comes out, it's going to be 2 at once because it's just a week separating Imbalance Part 2 and Runes Part 1. And, like, once we hit that point, yeah, there's going to be more content. But it's a very frustrating, like, point as an Avatar fan to, you know, have to wait, you know, 5 months between Imbalance Part 1 and Imbalance Part 2 where nothing is happening, and then knowing that, like, everything is scheduled to come out over the course of, like, the same 2-3 months. And then it's going to happen again more towards the end of the year with Imbalance Part 3 and Ruins Part 2, and so on. So, you know, it's just, I'd like it to be a bit more regular, and that's where, again, I'll bring up the idea that I've mentioned a few times before, and that being, why does it just feel like we are kind of locked into the 3 of these per comic series format? Why is this the format for Avatar comics and we can't do anything else? Why does it have to be 3 small books, 72 pages only, and that's it? Because it feels like a very limiting format at this point. So something like North and South, I think, is an example of a book that they struggled to fit that story into the 3-part structure that they had. they neither could extend it out as much as they need to or cramp it down into what they needed to. It just really felt restricted by the format that it was dealing with. It means that you can't really tell shorter stories because you always have to tell it across 3 books, over 200 pages. You can't really tell longer stories because at that point you then have to move the story into like multiple comic series. And the comics, as I've just explained, haven't been the best example of doing the storytelling across multiple different comics just because of the sheer amount of time that happens between it. The fact that nothing from Smoke and Shadow has been sort of followed up on just as of yet is kind of a good example of that. It's been 3 years and counting, and we're still waiting to come back to kind of anything that book had set up. So there's that, and I'll bring up the idea again. Why can't we have single issue comic format for Avatar where it's just monthly and we'll see where we go? Here's a mini series of like 3 issues. Here's a mini series of 5 issues. Here's an ongoing series where we tell a story across like 10 issues or something like that. Then we move into something else. I wonder why it's just this unique format, because I look on the shelves when I go into my local comic book store, and Avatar comics are the only comics I see that kind of use this format. You see every once in a while a couple of other tie-in kind of comics have this sort of smaller format, but it's usually like a one-off thing. It's just like a one-off Incredibles like comic series that they do it in something like this. But like something that has a consistent format like this, where like every series is told in 3 parts per story, and there are multiple stories, and they are kind of continuing into each other. It feels weird that like we're doing it this way, and there's no real distinction beyond that outside of the couple of free comics that we've got and the couple of anthology collections that we've had. I want to see a little bit more experimentation, and that's why the Kyoshi novel is so interesting to me. That's why the announcement of that and the kind of build up towards its release is so exciting, because it's a way to tell a story in a different way. And I hope it's a success so that the books, but also the comics, decide to do different stuff as well. So that's basically what I want to talk about, is just the sort of frustration of why has it been 7 years and Mei and Zuko still aren't back together? Why has it been, like 6 years and we still haven't had another Azula Ursa interaction? Why has it been 3 years since like we've seen Suki in the comics? 3 years since we've seen Azula in the comics? 3 years since Kigi? All these sort of things just add up the more and more time goes on. And it's unfortunate that in those 3 years, we've probably had the 2 weaker comics in North and South and Turf Wars. Now, things look to be improving, because In Balance, I think, will be a better book in overall than North and South. And Rubens looks to be much better than Turf Wars. But still, like we've had to wait a long time to get here. And then still In Balance, I don't really think is going to tackle much of the big stories that we kind of want to go back to from Smoke and Shadow especially. So in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on what I had to say in this video. But yeah, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.